Hello everyone, welcome to Science Friday.
Here's some for E as well. The one on the top here is one of the ways that you can define E.
What makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution?
So this can be like, in the case of this paper, gyrification or brain folds.
A neuroscientist started to look at the brain as...
I do run a lot. So the question came to me out of a family history. I've had heart problems in my family. They've run in my family, so to speak, from cardiac arrests while running to premature heart attacks at a younger age. There have been a few in my family, and I continue to live with a heart murmur. And I attached a graph of my heart rate about 2 years ago. I also had an irregular heart arrhythmia. So on any given day, this was one easy run, my heart rate would be around 145, and then halfway in the run, it would spike to about 180, 190 with no change in pace. So that was a condition that lasted for a few months, which was ultimately corrected by procedure. But it did lead me to a couple of further questions. So I was considering how it would affect me. Would I be the next in my family to have some sort of catastrophic event? And I was worried that my previous heart issues would make it impossible for me to run at a high level, or at least maintain a high level, and also considered whether it was counterintuitive to my heart health. So ultimately, that is what the study that I investigated has pursued. So just some general stats. Cardiac arrests are not very common when running. It's about 0.54 per 100,000 runners, so you'd have about one cardiac arrest per every 200,000 runners who were going on any run at any given day. And noticeably, 70% of those who do suffer cardiac arrest ultimately die from it. An out-of-hospital rate for the general population is about 7 to 11 per 100,000 people, and 90% of those die. So automatically, there's a little bit of reduced risk of death of those who do suffer a cardiac problem, but it's not significant, and there is further investigation to be done. So the first initial investigation into this type of issue was the London bus study, which in 1953 showed that coronary heart disease, specifically mortality from it in London bus drivers, was 2 times higher than the general population. And it led to a base hypothesis that physical activity can prevent coronary heart disease, because most London bus drivers are sitting around all day doing nothing. Or at best, it can prevent premature death from any sort of mortality. And that led to a lot of studies beginning in the 60s and 70s and later on. And also had a couple of remaining questions from that. Is there an optimal level of activity, and is there an ideal type of activity? And interestingly, Denmark is this place where the study was performed, and it's quite interesting because it's a really large study, the Copenhagen Heart Study, the Copenhagen City Heart Study. And there's a lot of different ways that it has actually taken place. So it started in the 1970s by a Danish runner who was actually a marathon runner who had tachycardia and other heart issues when he was running, and he wanted to consider what specific issues arise from running and if he should tone down his running to better suit his own health. So it began in 1976, and there were a couple of other studies that came off of that. There was another study by the same author in the 1990s, and then he wanted to get further data and add more data to that. So in 2001, he added the specific study that we'll be looking at, which is looking at mortality in jogging from all causes. And Denmark also has a particular interest in running. So in 1969, there was this Ermitage race of 7.6 miles that was held for the first time. And during that race, there was a fatal heart attack. So it left a lot of people really worried about running and heart health. And some other interesting notes about the study. It's just jogging data. It was a survey, and it looked at frequency and duration to intensity. And then other aspects of the Copenhagen Heart Study have been added. So basically, they have all the survey data, and they try to get other things from that, whether that be rates of dementia based on how much you run, do you turn to alcohol more often or less often if you run, and that was ultimately what the survey was. So a couple of notes on the methodology. It was a questionnaire with self-categorization, so you would be asked, with a random population, participants were chosen at random. It was some healthy joggers and some joggers who didn't, or some individuals who didn't jog at all, and they had about 1,098 healthy joggers, and I believe something around 3,000 unhealthy joggers. And ultimately, it was also a wide age range from 20 to 86, and they used a hazard ratio as their main baseline. And unfortunately, they didn't actually link or show any of their calculations, but they just used a standard statistical model. But at its core, hazard ratio is looking at the ratio of a specific hazard happening, and you compare it against some baseline. So they calculated a general hazard or risk of dying if you didn't run at all. And then they would look at the hazard ratio of those of like your risk of dying or from any cause just by your amount of running, and they would normalize it by age. So you would try to adjust for things like age and other pre-existing conditions, and then you can try to compare hazard ratios against one another to ultimately figure out if your risk of death is higher or lower. So generally, if you have a hazard ratio of 1, that's just your baseline, and if the hazard ratio is higher than 1, let's say it's 1.2, the risk of dying from that new activity is 1.2 times higher. So we can start looking at some of the data that they came to. So it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's just a typical survey. And they have a number of participants, and then they adjust their model based on pre-existing conditions so they can have more fair populations. And ultimately, you can see a wide variety of hazard ratios present, where 1 is just the typical hazard ratio of not jogging at all. And clearly, the results from this show that any sort of quantity of jogging is going to reduce your hazard ratio. And there's another interesting thing here. We can see that typically, most of the people in the study were jogging less than 1 hour a week. There are still a lot of individuals who were jogging a lot per week. And based on the initial observations of hazard ratios, the lowest risk of death came from those who jogged between 1 to 2.4 hours per week. And then based on adjustments, you still see the same results, where if you jog between 1 to 2.4 hours per week, you still have a relatively low hazard ratio. They also looked at the frequency of jogging, which is slightly different than the number of times, but the duration you jogged for. Instead, it looked at how many times per week. So someone could theoretically just jog for 1 time per week, but jog a marathon every week, which is still a lot of running, but it's slightly different than what you'd be seeing earlier. And they still see the lowest hazard ratio here is 0.29 on the bottom, which is noticeably far lower than what you would see with Gurdon 3 times per week, indicating that a risk of death there is particularly low. And then finally, they looked at the speed of jogging and trying to differentiate based on how fast you run to see if that changes your hazard ratio or your risk of death compared to someone who didn't run at all. And as you can see here, there's also large differences, but we'll get to this in a bit. But the biggest result here is perhaps if you jog very fast compared to regular, or just not running at all. So that was the survey data. And then they also have a final alternate categorization where they would make their own chart to do another test of what type of runner you are. So combining all 3 factors, you can get if you're a light jogger, a moderate jogger, a strenuous jogger. So they take your frequency of jogging, and they first ask you how you would categorize your pace, if you are slow for yourself, if you are average for yourself, or if you are fast. And then they also look at if you are a slow runner and you jog this certain frequency, and then you can figure out, do you go for more than 2 hours a week, 3 hours a week? Then you can figure out which one of these you would align with. If you are a strenuous jogger, a moderate, or light, the results for that we'll look at a second. So these are the results here, where after you categorize based on what type of jogger you are, after you go through the table and you figure out if you're a light, moderate, or strenuous jogger, there's still a noticeable difference in hazard ratio, where particularly the light joggers see the lowest hazard ratios. And interestingly, if you're a strenuous jogger, the hazard ratio is about 2.0, which is 2 times higher, indicating that if you are a strenuous jogger, every day on average you would be running strenuously. Your risk of death is 2 times higher than if you didn't jog at all. So there are other takeaways from the results. So as we were going through them, there were some interesting notes that we came across. In particular, that jogging at a faster pace is harmful. So of the survey participants, over 1,000 of them, jogging at a fast pace observes roughly the same hazard ratio as a non-jogger. So if you're jogging at a fast pace, there are 192 of them. 6 of those individuals died in the follow-up. So I should mention that the survey initially took place between 2001 and 2003. But they followed the participants in that survey until 2015. So consistently looking at, even after the jogging data was tracked, did you die at a relatively early age compared to what age you were in the survey? And the hazard ratio here pretty much aligns, suggesting that if you ran at a fast pace for you on any given day, your risk of death from any cause, even after adjustments for pre-existing conditions, is the same as not jogging at all. But on the other hand, if you jogged at an average pace, your risk of death is nearly half that. So you'd be at a much bigger advantage if you were jogging at an average pace than if you were not jogging at all. And then they also came to a conclusion about the ideal frequency you can jog at. So there's also some big differences here. So the hazard ratio of 0.71 for jogging 3 times or more per week is pretty close to risk of death, albeit still a 20% reduction in the chance, but it's still quite large in the sense that it's 0.71 compared to 0.32, so it's almost half that if you jog 2 to 3 times per week than if you did 3 times or more. And obviously, that's probably prone to the fact that 3 times per week, greater than that, can also count for 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, and 7 days, whereas 2 to 3 is just a smaller range. So obviously, if you jogged 4 times per week, your hazard ratio is probably going to be closer to 0.32 than it is if you jogged 6 or 7 days per week. But ultimately, they came to the conclusion that 1 to 2.4 hours per week and 2 to 3 times per week is about the same. And that's your best shot at ensuring that your risk of death isn't going to change significantly, whereas if you didn't jog at all, your risk of death would still be somewhat high, and even worse than that if you jog at a really fast pace many times per week. And you should also take some of these results with a grain of salt. It's an associative study, which essentially is just drawing, there's no causal relationship, it's just correlating the fact that typically people who ran this amount per week ultimately saw more death or less death, but it's not necessarily saying it caused one another. And that's where the Copenhagen study is a little bit interesting, because they have other studies that try to establish a correlation, but don't necessarily do that. So they ultimately say, in another Copenhagen study, coronary heart disease participants, we identified all the participants in the study with coronary heart disease, how many of them died based on running, and still you can't obviously establish a perfect correlation, but it's trying to get there. And it's also a usage association, which means there's a precise sweet spot. So that means if you jog almost none at all, you're going to have a high risk of death. And ultimately, you come down into the center where you hit some sweet spot where you have a lower risk of death, which is around the 1 to 2.4 hours per week of jogging at an average pace. But then if you start going a little bit higher and you go to a little bit faster of a pace, and ultimately you push the pace to a strenuous pace, and you jog 4 or 5 times per week, and almost every time you jog, you're at a strenuous pace, that's going to give you this U-shaped association where your risk of death increases again. So the hazard ratio attempts to overcome this by saying the inherent hazard to running a certain day and factoring in the specific types of running you're doing. And even though it overcomes that a little bit, it's still not perfect. And some other interesting notes here is that it's not socioeconomically or demographically diverse. And as I mentioned, it was chosen at random, but Copenhagen is a fairly white city, so most of the participants were white. And they did get a wide age range, but also at the time, the specific areas they were choosing from weren't necessarily considered lower class or upper class. It was typically most middle class participants. And obviously, small target populations make it challenging to infer the broader scope. So it's just looking at Denmark. We're not looking at across Europe or across other different areas. But we can still try to generalize some things from Denmark and say perhaps it applies more broadly to other populations. So there are a lot of broader implications with this. Do I feel reassured? Yes and no. Most of my running isn't strenuous, and when I do run fast, it's really only 1 or 2 times per week on specific days. And the general advice for people who run competitively is 80% or more of the miles you run are at an easy pace, and that aligns with this data, which is, I guess, is good. And when I did have the heart rate issue, that would make an easy run turn into a difficult run based on the heart rate alone. So even if I was running at what was a slow or slower average pace, my heart rate would act as though it's a really fast run, which ultimately was damaging because it made it feel like I was running really fast. I would have less energy the next day and felt like I was in worse health, and that's what the cardiologist did identify. And it also says that moderate jogging is clearly superior. You don't have to be a strenuous runner if you don't want to, and if you are a strenuous runner, you have to have a plan to take care of your body, so you ultimately figure out what is working for you. If your heart rate gets too high, how do you deal with that? How do you get enough nutrients to be able to ensure that you can keep that in check? And finally, I guess the main conclusion you should take away from this is that regardless of what pace you run, on average, those who are active and those who run have a 30% lower risk of death with regards to exercising, regardless of pace. So clearly, exercise is going to give you some sort of mortality benefit, whether that be a longer lifespan or reducing the prevalence of some other alternate death cause, whether it be dementia from other studies. But I guess you should take away the fact that running is good for your health, and it just matters what pace you run at and what you ultimately choose, and how you choose to run is going to impact other lifespan causes.